Hi, everyone. This is John Daly. I am back with another episode of the Daily Express. Today, I have our first ever third time guest on the show today. He's a lawyer, investigator, writer, and former congressional staffer who recently got back from a very interesting trip that he's going to talk to us about. I'm talking about Clifford Smith. How's it going today, Cliff?
It's going great. It's quite a week to be alive. More good reasons, more good and bad at the same time going on, but it's been an adventure, and from my point of view.
Yeah, a lot going on. Well, thanks for joining me. Like you say, there's obviously a lot going on in the news right now, especially with the global economic meltdown that's currently underway. But I wanted to have you on to talk about another topic that was pretty prominent in the news cycle until just recently, Ukraine. You were recently there for a firsthand perspective. Cliff, can you talk about what you were doing there, which parts of the country you went to, and most importantly, what you saw?
Sure. So look, I'm a foreign policy guy. I've been interested in foreign policy for a very long time, and born during the Cold War, so I always kind of thought about Russia and Eastern Europe and all that kind of stuff. And so I'd always kind of watch these issues out of the corner of my eye. But in 2014, when I just sort of started doing freelance writing and thinking and on the side, writing about foreign policy in public, and I wrote a column in 2014 criticizing the Obama administration for doing far too little when Crimea was invaded in 2014, which was the precursor and the first time Ukraine's sovereignty was invaded, in modern times since its independence. And I still think, that basic stance was correct. And I think that a lot of the things I pointed out to were right, even back then. So I've cared about this issue for a very long time. Um, but as a foreign policy guy, as some people may know, I worked for a think tank in foreign policy, although more Middle East related issues and somewhat South Asian related issues, not so much Eastern European, but for nearly a decade. And, so I kept track of these kinds of issues. And um, when Ukraine was invaded by Russia in the full scale way just a few years ago, I recognized it immediately for what it was. And that was a challenge to the post World War II order and the post Cold War order that had been hard fought, won by America over generations, frankly. And it scared me and horrified me. And um, I was also very concerned that should this be allowed to continue in the way it's doing, that it's going to be catastrophic for my country. And so I started writing about it a little bit. Look, I'm not a Eastern European expert. I traveled and spent some time in Poland. That's about as close as I'd gotten to really, dealing with Eastern European politics. But I started paying closer attention, and I started writing mostly about it from a domestic political point of view, talking about, how the issue played in Republican primaries, trying to get people to take, sort of an old, more Reaganite stance, a more strong America, peace through strength stance on this. But it was when I had sort of upped my freelance writing background that I learned through some contacts of mine that there was a couple of guys, a few businessmen that were taking journalists to Ukraine that otherwise wouldn't be able to go. For example, Jim Garrity at National Review and the Washington Post. If you look, he wrote a whole bunch of columns about Ukraine, and that was because he's taken this trip a couple times. And I heard about it, and I sent them all the columns I had written on Ukraine, and they said, "Yeah, look, we'd love to take you." And so that just on last month, I went on a trip that ended up being 10 days in Ukraine, and it is a long journey to get there. Um, it is You cannot fly into Ukraine these days; it's just not possible. So I had to go from DC to Frankfurt, from Frankfurt to Krakow, Poland, and then Krakow, Poland, take a taxi to Łatrain, that train to the Polish border. When you cross the Polish border, you get on another train that takes you all the way to Kyiv. And so, I mean, that's basically a 2 day long process. And It's very interesting, but very long.
Oh,
and and so but while I was there, I did not stay sedentary. I was in Kyiv. I was in Bucha, which is a suburb of Kyiv, fairly famous for the place they found mass graves very quickly after the full-scale invasion. I was also in Lviv, which that's in the far west, but I was also in Kharkiv. And Kharkiv is very far to the east. It's the second biggest city in the region, and it also is the one nearest the Russian border that's not near sort of the bulk of the fighting. So the bulk of the fighting is in the south, the southeast, and Kharkiv is more in the northeast. But that was very enlightening insofar as um, I will say this trip blew up a lot of myths for me, and I did pay fairly close attention. But one was, you sort of understood if you paid attention to the news what was going on in the front lines. You understood the carnage, you understood the civilians that were taking damage, you understood all that kind of stuff, and you understood to some degree that the Russians were attacking energy infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. At least that's what I understood. But I did not have a solid grasp of the geography of Ukraine and how it works. And so I knew, I mean, as a journalist, maybe a few real hardened war correspondents can go to the front line in very, very small doses. But, for the most part, you just can't really go to the true front lines. What I did not realize, though, is places like Kharkiv or Sumy or some of the other places that are eastern and close to the Russian border get hit all the time by drones, by glide bombs, by other forms of Russian attacks, short of, being invaded, with tanks. Now, Kharkiv, for example, actually was invaded by tanks very early on in the war, as was Kyiv and Bucha, some of these other cities that you've heard of. But the Ukrainians pushed them back very quickly, something the Russians did not expect. They didn't expect the level of resistance they got. And by quickly, I mean a matter of months, not a matter of days or hours. But, they were pushed out of both of those cities. It was very interesting to see, for example, in Kharkiv, how that went down. There was a local guide that showed me, okay, here's the road the Russians went in on. Then they came in over this field, and then he showed me the other side of this field, which was a neighborhood called Saltivka. Saltivka was 500,000 people lived there. It was one of the biggest neighborhoods in Ukraine, and it looked very much like what you might expect a Eastern European behind the Iron Curtain heavily populated area look like, sort of the gray, boring looking kind of Soviet era apartments, that kind of thing. All blown to hell. I mean, every single one of them has had massive damage. Every window was blown out. There was, floors falling off in some parts of them. There was giant holes everywhere. Some were worse than others, of course, but, it was very clear the Russians just invaded and just started shooting. They weren't paying close attention to what at. And so that was something that was very interesting to see. I will stress that when I talk about the old Soviet era buildings and stuff, that was not like everything else in Ukraine. That was not even like everything else in Kharkiv. Matter of fact, not far away from Saltivka, right across basically the main drag that goes to it, there was a mall that we parked at, and I went in and I got a cup of hot chocolate. The mall, if you had told me, if you had covered up some, Cyrillic writings in different stores and told me that I was in Columbus, Ohio, I would have believed you. It was brand new, and it was open for business. At the same time, in that same parking lot was a Home Depot, or the Ukrainian equivalent thereof, that no longer existed. It was being rebuilt. There was materials to start rebuilding it. But just last year, so not in 2022 when the Kharkiv was invaded, but in 2024, a Russian glide bomb destroyed the supply store and killed 19 people. That was just one of many attacks. In the recent weeks, you've had dozens more get killed. A child got killed, many more hurt. It's got struck a whole bunch in the few weeks since I got there. There were air raids while I was there. I don't know that any of those got through. I mean, they do have air defense of different sorts and things. They don't always get through. Obviously, I wasn't hit personally, but there was stuff going on while I was there. And sort of the extent of the damage was eye-opening. And it's something that not a lot of people see, frankly, even journalists. I mean, I don't want to make myself out to be some kind of hero, but a lot of journalists stick to Kyiv, they stick to Lviv. Kharkiv, I'm not saying it's super dangerous, but, there's some danger there, and they don't get that far. And I had a guide that actually was trying to work with any journalist that could go there up until a few months ago when his organization folded because USAID's funds were cut for his organization that was working closely with journalists. He did it for me for free because he knew my guide. I donated some money to him, and he told me he'd give it to people that were more needy than him. It's still thriving, but the point is that these are the kind of realities that I feel like Americans don't get enough of, don't understand. So that's sort of what I saw there.
Before you move on, I was
Go on
curious.
and on and on. So yeah, please stop me and ask me something else that I'm missing here.
Oh yeah, no worries. I was just curious. So you talked about air raids while you were there. While you were there, was any of this during, the supposed ceasefires that we supposedly were negotiating with
So
Russia? I
yeah,
was curious.
I mean, when that sort of proposal was, so Trump had this call with Putin on, what was it, the 15th, 16th, something like that. I can't remember the exact date. Last month, so less than a month ago, and there was a phone call, and it was announced that they were contemplating the ceasefire. And I was driving around Kyiv, meeting with folks, meeting with religious leaders, with political leaders, with drone innovators, other people like that, while this phone call was going on. We went out to dinner after we were done. We sat at a very nice dinner, had some great pierogies and stuff like that, at a very nice restaurant, which is all over Kyiv. Kyiv is another whole story. It's a fascinating city. By the time we were done for dinner and driving back to our hotel, so about 2 hours after Trump's phone call was going on, the city started getting hit with drones. There were explosions in the sky from the air raid defense, and this was just 2 hours later, and it went on for several more hours. And I don't believe anybody died that particular day. 3 people did. I know Kyiv, being the capital, as you might suspect, is the most heavily fortified. They have anti-drone missiles and anti-drone drones and other um, devices to screw up Russian attacks, and it's the most heavily defended of any city. So less gets through, but 3 people did die while I was in Kyiv from Russian attacks. And again, I think it was very telling that these attacks were launched hours after he's having this talk with Trump, when has a supposed ceasefire. I think you need to draw conclusions from that fact.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it seems, President Trump makes it a point to say that, Putin respects him. He didn't respect Biden. And I haven't seen much evidence of that respect yet. I mean, it seems, it's strange to see our treatment of Zelensky in Ukraine as compared to that of Putin in Russia, where Zelensky, he eats a lot of crow, but he's diplomatic about it and everything, but he takes a lot of crap, from Donald Trump and friends. Putin doesn't seem to take any crap from any of them. He doesn't seem to have any fear of Trump. Am I wrong in that assessment?
I think it's a little. I think it's a little bit complicated. I do think that Putin is a very manipulative person, and he knows how to manipulate his target. Clearly, he has a friendlier ear with Donald Trump, and I think that he uses that to his advantage. And I think that some of the Trump administration's gyrations on this have been horrifying and disgusting. There's no way around it. I mean, the treatment of Zelensky, the sort of lionization of Putin is disgusting. At the same time, I'm a little careful about overstating things like this too much, because I do think that look, Biden did far too little, far too late when it came to supplying Ukraine. And what's more, I do think that that the collapse of Afghanistan, which I do think was partially about 50% Trump's fault, because I think he negotiated the Doha Agreement, not Joe Biden. But the way that went down, which was again under Joe Biden, I do think that had an impact on Russian psyche. If you, I read right before I left, I read Mission to Moscow, which is a book. This book, I believe, is called that, by the last ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. He was the only ambassador to survive from Trump through to Biden's term. He lasted he was in the first year of Biden's term, and he was the ambassador to Moscow. And he made very clear something that was enlightening to me. He said that after the collapse of Afghanistan, he was being openly mocked, not just by diplomatic people he was meeting with, but by people on the street of America's supposed weakness and fecklessness. And I think that that's a bipartisan problem. It's not. It doesn't excuse what Trump did, but I do think you have to look at the wider problem America's had with this issue, because I would argue, at least based on what's happened so far, that um, Biden was better than Trump, but still, Biden was giving Ukraine enough to survive, not enough to thrive. And at the end of the day, this is going to continue to be a problem, in my view, so long as Russia is not beaten. And I don't mean held at bay. Held at bay is better than conquering all of Ukraine. Outright beaten is the only way this changes in the long run. And I think that neither side has actually done what it takes to do that. Um, yeah.
You were talking about the mockery, and I think that's very real. I've seen the same sort of thing, and it's interesting to see, like, not that I watch it, I see the clips online, but Russian state media, how they treat these things. Um, not just, they of course loved the Trump administration dressing down Zelensky a few weeks ago, but they're also right now really loving the economic crisis that's going on, the Trump's tariffs, which should be noted, Russia was one of the few countries actually exempted from those tariffs. But do you fear, Cliff, with this economic calamity that we're seeing, and uh, like J.P. Morgan right now is saying it's now likely we're going to go into a recession because of this. Do you think it'll be easier in a strange way for the United States now to abandon Ukraine, both on fiscal grounds, even if it's, I've been saying from the beginning, pointing out that
Yeah.
less than 1% of our annual budget goes toward Ukraine defense. It's
Yeah.
very small. But do you see it as the administration using this as an excuse, just, fiscal argument, and also it's in a strange way, even though it's of the Trump administration's own creation. Everybody's looking at their 401ks now, and I don't think many people are looking overseas and seeing what's going on with Ukraine. Is that
It's an
is
interesting question. I Let me start by saying that I think that it is wildly in America's best interest to support Ukraine, regardless of almost anything else. Let's say, for the sake of argument, something I do not believe, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that Ukraine can never push Russia out of the territories it's conquered, or even partially, and it's a frozen conflict, so we need to end it somehow. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that's true, even though I don't believe it. I would still argue that so long as Russia is willing to throw their bodies and their equipment against our weapons, it is in our best interest to continue to supply them, because in the long run, us degrading Russia's military is an objective good. It benefits us in almost every way possible. That's an unfortunate truth, but I think it is the truth. And so I want to start out with saying that. That said, I don't. It could. Certainly, they could use the fiscal logic, fiscal argument to get out of funding Ukraine. That said, this is actually taking some interesting turns. There's just today the London Telegraph, which is a very good paper that does both writing and reporting, podcasting, broadcast media, that kind of stuff on Ukraine. Probably the best that I know of. They were saying that actually there's an interesting sort of double whammy here insofar that's kind of a two-sided coin, a two-sided coin on this, and that is that the U.S. economy is taking a hit, huge hit. A lot of people are. The price of gas, because of that, has just fallen through the floor. That's going to hurt Russia really bad. So you could actually get a weird shock where that actually hurts Russia worse than it hurts us. So, look, Obama, in my opinion, almost completely mishandled Iran, right? And sometimes even doing horrible things do have silver linings. I would argue that a silver lining of Obama's Iran deal, which I think has demonstrably proven to be a disaster in many ways, but it was the creation of the Abraham Accords. I think it is very easy to make the argument the Abraham Accords happened because the Arab countries got freaked out that the U.S. might not back them against Iran. And so sometimes there are sort of neat side effects. Hopefully that's one. I also another kind of tangential thing on that is particularly since all the shenanigans of a month ago, the Europeans have been getting more serious about their own defense for quite some time. I'll even give Trump a little bit of credit. Him raising the issue, I thought he did it in a bad way, but during his first term, at least sort of got him talking about it and got him moving a little bit in that direction. They're taking that more seriously now. Now, I think that comes at a huge cost to America. America not being the guarantor of Europe's security will have massive negative economic, social, geopolitical implications for America. For Ukraine, at least temporarily, that could be, again, a silver lining, because the Russian military is not what it once was. It wasn't even what we thought it was when they started this war. They've taken nearly 1 million casualties. Now that's dead and wounded, and a lot of those are wounded. It's had massive, their estimates of over 50% of its armor destroyed. It's spending tons and tons of money on equipment that is just basically, drawing Ukraine to a standstill. You shoot your thing, you use your weapon to shoot down mine, and just kind of, there's a lot of destruction of their resources going on. It's very hard to replace U.S. intelligence. Replacing U.S. money is possible. There'd be downsides to it, but it's possible. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that sort of plays out over time. My hope is, for my own country's sake, and because I think it would save Ukrainian lives and make it more likely that Ukraine would unambiguously win, not only should we continue to do it, we should double down. Again, I think that having Russia actually overtly lose would pay dividends wildly beyond anything else we could do. But we're not the only actor, and the truth of the matter is, while we are a superpower, the more we abdicate our responsibility, the more others will attempt to take it up. They might not do as good of a job, but they will do it, and that will have effects, both negative and positive. More negative than positive, but both.
Do you, I'm curious, when you were talking to sort of everyday Ukrainians, I assume that I don't know what happened to my voice right there, but I assume that you were identified as an American. They understood that you were from the United States. Is that correct?
Some did. I was actually traveling with two Brits, so someone might have thought I was British. But it came up a fair amount, and most people, and quite a few people knew I was an American. Sure.
How do they treat you knowing that? I mean, United States has been, has given a lot of aid, obviously, to Ukraine. I'd say our relationship is a little bit different. I'm sure that news, the details of those differences aren't lost on the Ukrainian people. Do they treat you suspiciously at all, or were they pretty, hospitable, or did it kind of vary?
I'm glad you brought that up, because other than I would say I had quite a few takeaways from this trip. But if I could only choose two big ones, one of the one is what I've already told you, and that is that cities like Kharkiv and Sumy and other ones that are near Russia and they get hit, and Sumy nowhere near the front line, get hit far more, and far more people die, far more damage is done than I understood at the time before going. The other thing that I just had no preparation for, that I was shocked, pleasantly so, but shocked, was that there is no suspicion that I encountered. Not only is there no suspicion, there is negative suspicion. I thought for sure, frankly, that I'd run into sort of look. I'm not the greatest traveled person in the world, but I've traveled around a bit. I've been to Germany, I've been to France, I've been to the UK, I've been to Ireland, I've been to Luxembourg, been to Poland a few times. I've been around Europe. Traveled to India, traveled to Israel, been to Jordan, been to Egypt. I've been around. The sort of latent anti-Americanism that comes from being the world superpower and having people resent it or dislike what we do, I'm used to it. And I don't speak French, and I go to France and I expect the French to kind of give me the side eye when I, ask, speak two words of French and then start talking to them in English, and they usually know what I'm talking about, but they're frustrated by it, right? That's what I expected in Ukraine. Not only did I not see it, I saw the reverse. this is a big takeaway that really shocked me. Almost every single time I talked to Ukrainians that figured out as American, they would apologize to me for not speaking good enough English. And the vast majority in the cities did speak English. And most of them, when they were apologizing for speaking imperfect English, um, spoke English better than a lot of Americans, frankly. and and there was not only not a resentment of America that I ever encountered, there was something resembling the exact opposite. Um, I will even say I expected the sort of latent anti-Americanism I've seen in other places I've traveled to rear its head more because of everything that went down in the weeks up to me going with the Trump administration. I was shocked by most Ukrainians' attitude. More than once, I said, "Hey, look, I didn't support this thing my government did. Sorry about that," kind of talk, and none of them got angry. They didn't, get express disgust or start ranting. Most of them said something along the lines of, "Well, things are kind of going weird in America, but we're going to win this fight, and you know what? We'll flip the Americans. We got to kind of explain some things to. We'll figure this out. We'll flip them." And it was a confidence and a belief that at the end of the day, they knew the average American was on their side, and they thought that they could do things to sort of um, flip the Trump camp back to them. I hope they're right, but the amount of um, positive sentiment towards American, and America more generally, even in the current time, um, was something that was totally unexpected for me, and frankly beyond anything I've experienced. I didn't feel even that way. Even in London, I didn't feel that way. It's also worth noting, and this is some of those kind of hard to put your finger on sort of things. And it's a big country. I saw a big, huge chunk of it, but I didn't see all of it. And there's a lot more to it, but particularly in the big cities, particularly in Kyiv, particularly in Kharkiv, even um, the cities even took more inspiration from American cities. It struck me. I mean, the amount of brand new restaurants and stores and things that weren't American brands, but looked kind of like a store in, Roanoke, Virginia, or, Miami, Florida. It was surprising to me, very surprising. And the way people dressed and interacted, sort of the way their people did things, struck me more American than European. At least if by European you mean French or German or sort of what we usually think of as American. But even more so than Poland. And I'd spent some time in Poland, which is traditionally a very pro-American country. Again, for some of the same reasons, the Cold War. It was something I did not expect, and something that really did shape my thoughts about what I saw.
That's interesting. It's I was wondering about that because I know that a lot of these new democracies or relatively new democracies really have a certain affection for the United States. And I remember, this it feels like it was a long time ago, but at the end of George W. Bush's second term, when he was really sort of down in the dumps here in the United States, getting like I think his approval rating was in the 20s, something like that. I believe it was he went on a trip to Ukraine and I remember seeing the video from it. I mean, he was like Taylor Swift over there. They just adored the guy. He had these it was just so bizarre. I actually felt pretty good for him at the time. It was yeah, this huge,
Let me.
he
I
was
love.
Charlie Brown here, but a rock star over there.
Let me tell you one story that is interesting. That's related directly to what you're saying. And this is the closest I got to a negative comment on America when the issue came up. And it wasn't negative, but well, let me tell you the story. I visited Bucha with a pastor. This is a pastor that runs a evangelical seminary in Ukraine, outside of Kyiv, near Bucha, which is again one of the first places that was liberated and where you saw a lot of the mass graves. Um, and keep in mind, evangelicals are a minority in Ukraine. I don't know the exact number. Most are Orthodox, but anyhow, I was driving around Bucha. He was giving me a tour of Bucha and the mass graves and the destruction and the rebuilding of Bucha, which again was staggering. It was amazing how much they rebuilt in a short amount of time. although there still remains quite a bit of damage. He This issue came up in terms of, America's doing things that are not favorable to your country right now. What do you think? And he expressed a little sorrow and was disappointed. And then I said, this must be difficult. And he said, yeah. He's like, I'm paraphrasing, but just barely. He said, we Ukrainians have suffered the abuse of power, of great power, for a very long time. And he's like, in America, we saw perhaps great power could be for good. And this makes that harder to think about that. And that was both a very insightful comment about the world and also somewhat a sad comment about the state of things America's up to right now. Nonetheless, I do think it sort of explained the mindset of a lot of Ukrainians.
Well, that's some great insight, and I want to thank you, Cliff, for coming on today. When you first told me you were going to Ukraine, I was sort of jealous. I mean, I thought that, oh man, that would just be sort of an experience to do that. But yeah, I'm great. Yeah, I think it's great that you went. I really appreciate you coming on here and talking about that. I'm also in the show notes. I'm going to link to a couple pieces. There was a video piece you did. There was one you'd written, I believe, for Christian Today. So I'll put that in there as well. But yeah, this was very fascinating. Like last time, it was great having you on. Do you have anything else coming out soon that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I have another article the Christianity Today article you mentioned sort of was like kind of a sights, sounds, and smells of Kharkiv article. I wrote another one that was sort of more in the weeds, policy, history, also on Kharkiv. That's coming out in the Dispatch. Should be in a couple days. Keep your fingers crossed on that. And I'm hoping to write as much more as I can. I saw a lot. I mean, I met with a lot of religious figures. I talked to a lot of people, and I learned a lot about what's going on. So I'm hoping I can write a lot more about different aspects of what I saw, and I hope to stay involved in this issue. I really do believe that the outcome of this will, if not dictate, a lot of things in American foreign policy, at minimum, very strongly influence not just American foreign policy, but sort of international relations and international security for the foreseeable future. I think if Russia gets an unambiguous win, it will change the world orders in ways that will be almost impossible to repair. A partial win, it's complicated. A clear loss, and I think it can go back in the other direction. But either way, this is going to be a conflict that is going to change a lot of things. It is not, look, I don't mean to minimize, Afghanistan or Iraq or different things happen in Africa or what have you. There's a lot of things that happen along the world that are impactful for those people and even impact, foreign relations and international security in different ways. This is different, and it will have ramifications far into the future.
Yeah, no, the world is watching. A lot of bad people are watching to see what happens there. So, Cliff, thanks again, and I hope you have a great day. All right.
Thank you very much.